For 16 years, one man marched an army back and forth across the enemy's own homeland. He smashed every force they threw at him. He killed tens of thousands of their citizens in a single afternoon and left their fields black with smoke. And in all that time, 16 years camped inside their country, he never once took their city. He had spent more than 16 years fighting the Romans in Italy. Rome's greatest enemy won almost every battle he ever fought, and he still lost the war. Sit with that, because it doesn't make sense the way we're taught history is supposed to work. The genius wins, the blunderer loses. And yet here is a general so gifted that 2,000 years later, military academies still study the way he wrapped an entire Roman army in a ring of steel and annihilated it. And he is remembered, above all, as the man who came closest to destroying Rome and failed. How that happened is one of the strangest survival stories in the ancient world.
It's a story about a boy, an altar, and a promise. And it starts with something whispered into a child's ear. If you're the kind of person who wants the whole story, not just the version squeezed onto a schoolbook page, take a second to subscribe and hit like. It genuinely decides whether channels like this one keep telling these stories. Now, let's go back to that altar. The city is Carthage, on the coast of what is now Tunisia, and the year is somewhere near the middle of the 3rd century before Christ. A general is preparing to sail west to Spain, to a war of conquest that will fund everything his family dreams of. Before he goes, he stops to make an offering to the gods. His 9-year-old son is standing beside him, and, according to the ancient sources, the boy begs to come along on the campaign. This is the moment. This is the scene that fixed a man's name into the memory of the world for 2,000 years.
Two of antiquity's most important historians, the Greek Polybius and the Roman Livy, both preserve it, and they agree on the essentials. The father was sacrificing to the gods when he asked the boy, kindly, whether he wished to accompany him on the expedition, and when the boy accepted with delight, and, like a boy, even begged to do it, his father took him by the hand, led him up to the altar, and bade him lay his hand on the victim and swear never to be the friend of the Romans. The father was Hamilcar Barca. The boy was Hannibal. Now I want to be honest with you about that scene because it matters. This story comes to us entirely from the winning side. We should not forget that it was recorded by the winning side. There are no surviving Carthaginian sources, and Polybius, the Greek historian who chronicled Hannibal's life, was in the service of Rome. So we can't stand in that temple and swear the words were spoken exactly as written.
What we can say is this:
Hannibal himself told the story. Decades later, an old man at the court of a foreign king, cornered in an argument and running out of ways to prove his loyalty, reached for this memory of the altar as the one thing that could not be doubted. He offered it as proof of who he was. And for the next 36 years, whatever the exact wording, Hannibal never once wavered from that childhood vow. That's the part that gives me chills. Not whether a 9-year-old understood what he was promising, but that the man he became lived every single year of his adult life as though those words were law. So the real question isn't whether the oath happened. It's this: what kind of family raises a child to swear eternal war on a city he has never even seen? What had Rome done to make a defeated general point his own son at the enemy like a loaded weapon? To understand that, you have to understand two cities that could not share a sea. Picture the Western Mediterranean around this time, not as a map with borders, but as a single crowded marketplace, and only 2 shopkeepers big enough to matter. On the North African coast sat Carthage, old, rich, and utterly of the sea. It had begun as a Phoenician trading post, and over a few centuries had swallowed the mantle of the greatest commercial power in the region. By this era, its commercial empire included North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, Cyprus, Malta, and many other islands of the Mediterranean. Think of it as the trading superpower of its age, the way a handful of financial capitals dominate the modern world, moving money and goods no one else could touch. And the wealth was staggering. Carthaginian ships pushed out past the Strait of Gibraltar, up the Atlantic coast, and reportedly all the way to Britain, chasing the tin that the ancient world needed to make bronze the way our world needs oil. They got amber, tin, silver, and furs from the Celts and Gauls. Sardinia and Corsica produced gold and silver, and Phoenician settlements on islands like Malta and the Balearics sent commodities back to Carthage for large-scale distribution. The city itself was a wonder. The wealth generated by Carthage attracted merchants and ambitious people from all across the ancient world, and by this century, there were an estimated 200,000 people living in it. 200,000! A metropolis in an age when most people had never seen a settlement larger than a village. At the heart of it was a harbour unlike anything else in the world. A circular military dock, ships slotted in like cars in a modern parking garage, and in the very centre, a command building where the admirals sat and watched their fleet. At its peak, Carthage had between 300 and 350 warships, and in the event of an attack, it could chain each harbour shut to keep enemy ships out. This was a state that thought in terms of trade routes and tariffs, run by wealthy merchant families who elected their leaders and ran the place more like a corporate board than a nation of soldiers. Now turn and look across the water at the other shopkeeper. Rome, in the center of Italy, was almost the exact opposite. Not a merchant empire, but a farmer republic. Its power didn't come from gold vaults or trading fleets. It came from land, and from an idea so simple it was terrifying. That a free man farming his own plot would drop his plow, pick up a spear, and go to war for the city that let him keep his land. That's the thing that made Rome so dangerous, and it's the thing that would eventually beat Hannibal. So hold on to it. The citizen soldiers of the early Roman army were enrolled for a specific amount of time rather than signing up for years of service, which meant the legions of the Republic had no long, continuous existence. They were disbanded once the campaign was over. These weren't professionals. They were men who left the harvest, fought a season, and went home. And here is the strange, cold genius of the Roman system. Because the soldiers were the citizens, and the citizens were the farmers, Rome had a bottomless well of manpower. Beat a Carthaginian army, and you might break Carthage's will because it had paid for those men. Beat a Roman army, and next spring another one simply grew out of the fields. Two systems then. One that bought its wars with money, one that grew its wars out of dirt. And between them, right in the middle of that crowded marketplace, sat a single island neither could stand to let the other own. Sicily. The first collision came a generation before Hannibal's oath, and it was enormous. The longest continuous war the ancient world had yet seen. The First Punic War lasted 23 years, the longest continuous conflict and the greatest naval war of antiquity, as the two main powers of the Western Mediterranean struggled for supremacy. 23 years. To put that in human terms, a child born when it started could have fought in it as a grown man and still not seen the end. And it was fought over and over for control of that one island. The maddening thing, from Carthage's point of view, was that Rome had no business winning a war at sea. Carthage was the naval power. Rome barely had a fleet. And then Rome did something that should have been impossible. It built a navy almost from scratch, reportedly using a captured Carthaginian vessel as a blueprint, and defeated a power that had dominated the Western Mediterranean for centuries. Imagine a landlocked country deciding to take on the world's greatest navy, and building the ships by reverse engineering one they'd captured. That's the sheer, stubborn refusal to lose that Carthage was up against, and would be up against again. The end came off the western tip of Sicily. A Carthaginian relief fleet, heavy with supplies, ran into a Roman fleet that had learned its lessons and built better, faster ships. The Romans caught the Carthaginian relief fleet among the Aegates Islands off the west coast of Sicily. Now the roles were reversed, with the Roman fleet better trained and well-built, and the Carthaginians ill-prepared. And the Carthaginian fleet was soundly defeated. After 23 years, it came down to that. The terms were brutal. Carthage was made to withdraw from Sicily and had to pay Rome 3,200 talents of silver in reparations over the next decade. Sicily, the island Carthage had fought a generation to hold, became Rome's very first overseas province. And this is where the wound stops being a wound and starts becoming a poison. Because Rome wasn't finished. While Carthage was on its knees, its own unpaid mercenaries rose up in a savage revolt. The Romans and Greeks who wrote it down called it the Truceless War, and the name tells you everything. Carthage was fighting for its life against its own soldiers, and in the middle of that crisis, Rome moved. A Roman force was sent to occupy Sardinia, whose insurgent garrison had offered to surrender the island. To the protests of Carthage, the Romans replied with a direct declaration of war, and only withheld their attack once Carthage formally handed over Sardinia and Corsica and paid a further indemnity. Read that again slowly, because it's the real engine of everything that follows. Carthage was already beaten. It was bleeding out in a civil war it hadn't started, and Rome walked up, took 2 more islands it had no right to, and dared Carthage to object, knowing full well it couldn't. It's the ancient equivalent of a mugger returning to a man he'd already robbed, who was now lying in a hospital bed and taking his wedding ring too. The humiliation in Carthage was total. Now go back to that altar, because standing at it was the one Carthaginian who'd refused to accept that any of this was over. Hamilcar Barca was not a merchant. He was a soldier, and a brilliant one, and he had a grievance that aided him for the rest of his life. He had commanded in Sicily during that first war, and here is the detail that explains the man. He waged a masterful guerrilla campaign against the legions of Rome in western Sicily during the final 7 years of the war. Undefeated on land, he had been forced by a naval defeat to surrender Sicily to Rome. Undefeated on land. Do you see what that does to a man? He never lost. His country lost the sea, and the politicians surrendered the war out from under him, and he was ordered to hand over ground he had never yielded in battle. And then he watched Rome steal Sardinia besides. So when Hamilcar looked for somewhere to rebuild Carthage's strength, he didn't look toward peace. He looked toward Spain, its mines heavy with the silver that could pay off Rome's reparations and fund an army at the same time. Too politically influential to be left safely in Carthage after saving it, Hamilcar was packed off with an army to Spain, and from that point until his death, he subdued nearly the entire Mediterranean coast up to the Ebro River. He was building a war machine, quietly, at the far western edge of the known world, and he was training his sons to run it. There were several of them, and people who knew the family said Hamilcar didn't call them his sons. He called them his lion's brood, the cubs he was raising to tear Rome apart. He married his daughters into power to build the network his boys would need, and to the eldest, the one who'd sworn at the altar, he gave the war itself. When Hamilcar died on campaign,
Command passed briefly to a son-in-law, and when that man was assassinated, the army in Spain chose its next leader itself. It chose the young Barca. He was 25, maybe 26. Here's what I find remarkable about the next stretch. Hannibal was now the master of a private empire, with an army of veterans, in a land floating on silver, and a childhood oath burning in the back of his mind. And he waited. After being made supreme commander in Iberia at around 26, he spent 2 years maturing his plans and completing his preparations. 2 years, cold-bloodedly getting ready. And the Romans, who had every warning, did nothing. The Romans did nothing, though they received ample warning of Hannibal's preparations. They were yet to learn of the talent and determination of the man they had to deal with, and thought they could strike down this Carthaginian youth whenever they pleased. That contempt would cost them more than any nation had ever paid. The trigger, when it came, was a single town. Between Rome's sphere and Carthage's, both sides had agreed on a line, a river called the Ebro, that Carthage was not to cross under arms. But there was a city that sat awkwardly on the wrong side of everyone's understanding. Saguntum, a prosperous Iberian trading town on the coast. In the years before, a treaty had acknowledged Carthage's control of Spain south of the Ebro, but Saguntum enjoyed a long-standing treaty of friendship with Rome, so its status was ambiguous. Was it an ally of Rome, or a ward of Carthage? That ambiguity was the crack in the wall, and Hannibal drove his fist straight through it. To him, a town in his own backyard cozying up to Rome wasn't a diplomatic gray area. It was Rome doing again exactly what it had done with Sardinia, reaching into Carthaginian territory and daring anyone to stop it. And this time, someone would. In the year we'd call 219 before Christ, Hannibal marched on Saguntum and settled in for a siege. Now, walk up to those walls with me for a moment, because the people inside were not going to make this easy. Saguntum was rich, it was well fortified, and it fought like a city that knew exactly what surrender would mean. The defenders resisted valiantly from behind their impressive fortifications, even wounding Hannibal himself with one of their famous spears, which they drenched in flaming pitch and hurled down on their attackers. Their general, the man who had sworn never to be Rome's friend, took a wound from these people. And still, he did not lift the siege. Meanwhile, the citizens of Saguntum were doing the only thing they could, screaming for help across the sea to the friends who had promised to protect them. And Rome, the great power, the city that thought it could crush this Carthaginian boy whenever it pleased, Rome sent envoys. It sent words. When the besieged Saguntines appealed to Rome, Rome pressured the Carthaginians to recognize their alliance with Saguntum. But even as the Romans tried to negotiate a settlement, Hannibal captured the city after an 8-month siege. 8 months. Think about what that means. For 8 months, a Roman ally begged for rescue, and Rome debated, and issued demands, and sent embassies, and did not come. The town starved. And in the end, when hope was truly gone, the sources tell us the people of Saguntum chose the most terrible exit imaginable. After 8 months, the citizens finally gave up hope and committed mass suicide by setting fire to the town. Saguntum fell to the Carthaginians. They burned themselves and their city rather than be taken. That was Hannibal's opening statement to Rome. Now watch how empires talk themselves into catastrophe. When word of the fall reached Rome, the Senate finally roused itself and sent an embassy, not to save anyone, that ship had sailed months ago, but to lay down an ultimatum. Rome dispatched an embassy demanding the surrender of Hannibal and his leading counselors for violating the treaty
by attacking a Roman ally. Hand over the general, give us Hannibal, and this doesn't have to become a war. And here the Carthaginian Senate did something that tells you the fever wasn't in Hannibal alone. It refused. It argued that Saguntum had started the trouble. It argued that Rome had no standing to complain about broken treaties given Sardinia. They were disgruntled that Hannibal had broken the treaty set after the First War, but they pointed out that Hannibal was doing nothing all too different from the Roman Republic, which had recently annexed Sardinia despite a treaty. The scene in that chamber has come down to us as one of the great confrontations of the ancient world.
The Roman envoy, losing patience, is said to have gathered a fold of his toga and declared that he carried in it both peace and war, and that Carthage could choose which one he let fall. And the Carthaginians told him to let fall whichever he liked. He dropped war. The declaration came in the year 218. And here is where you have to understand the Roman mind, because it explains why what happened next hit them like the sky falling. The Romans assumed this would be a war fought anywhere but at home. They controlled the sea. They had beaten Carthage on the water before. So they planned to send one army to Spain to fight Hannibal on his own ground, and another to Africa to threaten Carthage itself. One consul was assigned 2 legions, with 14,000 allied Italian infantry, 1,600 cavalry, and 60 warships, to do battle with Hannibal in Iberia. The whole Roman strategy rested on one comfortable assumption: that the fighting would happen over there. That no sane commander would ever try to bring a war to Italy by land. They had no idea what was already moving toward them. Because while Roman senators debated shipping routes to Spain, Hannibal had gathered something the ancient world had rarely seen on one field. An army drawn from half a dozen nations, forged into a single instrument that answered to one man. A powerful army stood poised at the Ebro, comprising soldiers from many peoples and cultures. Heterogeneous as it was, most of them were veterans of 2 decades of continuous warfare, a cohesive army built for speed and shock, and it answered to one man and one will. Iberian swordsmen, slingers from the Balearic Islands, men trained from childhood to put a stone through a target at murderous range. Libyan spearmen, and the light cavalry that would haunt Rome's nightmares. The Numidians, horsemen out of North Africa who fought like ghosts, striking and vanishing before a heavier enemy could close. He was not going to Spain to wait for Rome. He was not going to Africa to defend Carthage. He was going to do the one thing no Roman in that Senate had prepared for, the one thing they had all agreed was impossible. He was going to march overland, across the Pyrenees, across Gaul, across the wild rivers, and then over the roof of the world, through mountains no army was ever supposed to cross, with elephants and tens of thousands of men. And he was going to bring the war to the doorstep of Rome itself, in the teeth of the coming winter. And the mountains were waiting. No general in his right mind should have tried it, and Hannibal knew that better than anyone. The Alps were not a road. They were a wall the whole ancient world assumed was closed to armies. A barrier the way an ocean was a barrier, something you went around, never through. And that assumption was exactly the weapon he intended to use. If everyone believed it couldn't be done, then no one would be waiting on the other side. So in late spring, he set out from the base of operations in Spain, and the number the sources give for what left with him is almost hard to picture. He crossed the Ebro River with an army of 90,000 foot and 12,000 horse, nearly 100,000 fighting men, plus the enormous train of animals, servants, and baggage that trailed any ancient army like a wake behind a ship. And with them, the detail that stunned everyone who heard it.
37 war elephants. Living siege engines brought out of Africa that most Europeans had never seen and could barely imagine. But listen to what happened to that army before it ever saw a single mountain. Because this is the part people forget. It bled the entire way.
Fighting the tribes of the Pyrenees, garrisoning the ground behind him, shedding men who deserted rather than march into the unknown. By the time he reached the great river that guarded the approach to the Alps, the 100,000 were already gone. He arrived at the Rhone with far fewer. Now stand on the bank of that river with the men who had to cross it. The Rhone is wide, fast, and cold, and on the far side, a hostile Gallic tribe had gathered to slaughter Hannibal's army as it came out of the water. The worst moment to fight, half drowned and disorganized, climbing a muddy bank into a wall of spears. So Hannibal did what he would do again and again. He refused to fight the battle his enemy expected. Under cover of darkness, he sent a detachment upstream, across at a quieter ford, to come down behind the waiting Gauls. And when a column of smoke rose on the far hills, the signal that his men were in position, he pushed the whole army into the current at once. The Gauls, hit from front and rear at the same instant, broke and ran. That still left the elephants, and getting 37 terrified, multi-ton animals across a rushing river is a problem no manual covers. The sources describe an extraordinary solution. They built enormous rafts, packed the edges with earth so the animals would think they were walking onto solid ground, and towed them out into the current. Some of the elephants panicked in the middle of the river and threw their drivers into the water, but the animals themselves, holding their trunks above the surface, waded and half swam their way across. Every one of them made it. The men who came from cities where an elephant was a rumor watched creatures the size of houses come dripping up the far bank, and I doubt any of them ever forgot it. And that, the river, the ambush, the elephants, was the easy part. That was before the mountains. We don't know, and probably never will know, exactly which pass Hannibal used. Historians have argued about it for 2,000 years, and are still arguing, walking the ridgelines with the ancient texts in hand, trying to match a described landmark to a real valley. What the sources do agree on is what the crossing did to the men who attempted it. Because the tribes of the High Alps did not need to defeat Hannibal's army in open battle, the mountain itself would do most of the killing. They just had to help. Picture the column strung out along a track barely wide enough for a mule, a wall of rock on one side and a drop into nothing on the other, ice underfoot, and above them, invisible until the last second, men who had lived on those slopes their whole lives. The attacks came from above. The tribesmen rolled boulders down onto the packed column, and in the narrow places, there was nowhere to go. Men and horses and pack animals, shoved off the edge by the panic of the animals beside them, simply fell out of the world. The sources describe pack animals slipping on the ice and dragging others with them into the ravines, whole strings of them going over, the baggage and the men lost in an instant, with no possibility of recovery. You did not die in a battle here. You died because the animal ahead of you spooked, and the ground was ice, and there was a cliff. The single worst stretch, the sources say, was a place where a landslide had wiped out the path entirely. Hannibal's army was trapped on a bare ledge, unable to go forward across the gap, and unable to turn a train of thousands around on a track a few feet wide. Below them, snow was already falling on old snow that hadn't melted from the previous winter, and the animals that stepped onto it broke through the crust and were stuck. For a day, the army sat there, freezing and starving, while engineers rebuilt a road across the void wide enough to bring the horses and the elephants through. The elephants, the accounts note,
had gone days without proper food by the time they were finally led across. Then, at last, the ground began to fall away in front of them instead of climbing, and Hannibal is said to have brought his exhausted men to a high point where they could look down and see the plains of Italy spread out below, the promised land at the end of everything they'd endured. But the descent was worse than the climb. Going down an icy slope with a starving army is more dangerous than going up, and more men and animals were lost on the way down than on the way up. So how much of that great army survived the mountains? The sources give a figure that tells you everything about the price of what he'd done. Hannibal came down into Italy with only about 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry left, from something near 100,000 at the Ebro.
Now, much of that loss came from garrisons left behind and troops peeled off along the way, not purely from the crossing. But even counting only the men who actually attempted the Alps, close to half of them never came down the other side. The march that made him legendary very nearly ended him. He had arrived in Italy with an army smaller than a single one of the armies Rome could field, and he had lost most of his elephants along the way, with only a handful surviving the mountains and the first hard winter beyond. And this is the moment I want you to really understand, because it's the hinge of the whole story. By every rational measure, Hannibal had just lost. He'd spent his elephants, his cavalry, and half his men on a stunt. He was in hostile territory with no way home, no supply line, and no reinforcements coming. A sensible general in that position digs in and prays. Instead, within weeks, he was going to take that ragged, frostbitten, starving remnant of an army and start winning. The first Roman commander to face him could not believe what he was seeing. He had expected to fight Hannibal in Spain. The man had appeared in northern Italy instead, like a ghost walking through a wall. There was a first clash of cavalry near the Ticinus River, in which the Roman commander himself was wounded and barely escaped. And the sight of Numidian horsemen wheeling and striking on ground everyone had assumed was safe sent a cold current of dread through the Roman camp. The two Roman consular armies of the year pulled back together, joined forces, and made camp on the near bank of a river in the north called the Trebbia to wait Hannibal out. Waiting was exactly what Hannibal wanted, because he had already read the man across the river like an open book. One of the two Roman commanders was cautious. The other was hungry. A new man eager for a great victory before his term of command ran out, and terrified that his cautious colleague would recover from his wound and steal the glory. Hannibal saw that hunger and decided to feed it. In the night before the battle, he sent a picked force of 1,000 cavalry and 1,000 infantry, his younger brother among them, to hide in the tangled brush and gullies of a dry stream bed on the flank of the field. Then he laid the bait. Now walk into that Roman camp before dawn on the day of the battle, because the way this was done is almost cruel in its precision. It is midwinter, it is bitterly cold, and Hannibal's Numidian horsemen come splashing across the icy river right up to the Roman pickets, loosing arrows, jeering, taunting. Provoke and retreat, provoke and retreat. The hungry consul takes the bait exactly as designed. He orders the whole army up and out, and here is the detail that seals their fate. He does it before the men have eaten, before they have warmed themselves at their fires, and he sends them straight into the freezing water of the river to chase an enemy that keeps just out of reach. Meanwhile, on the other side, Hannibal's men had eaten a full breakfast, warmed themselves at their fires, and rubbed their bodies with oil against the cold. One army came to the battlefield fed, warm, and rested. The other came half frozen, soaked to the chest, and starving, having waded a winter river at dawn. It was over before it truly began.
Hannibal's fresh infantry held the shivering Romans in place at the center. His cavalry and his terrible slingers shattered the Roman wings. And then, at the moment the Romans were fully committed and fully exhausted, the 2,000 men hidden in the streambed erupted out of the brush and slammed into the Roman rear. The result was slaughter. The bulk of the Roman army was destroyed in the freezing water and the fields beyond it. Only a hard core in the very center managed to punch straight through Hannibal's line and escape to safety through the storm. Everyone else was killed, drowned, or scattered. In his first real battle on Italian soil, with a starving remnant of an army, Hannibal had annihilated a full Roman force, and he had done it by attacking the one thing no weapon could defend: the enemy commander's pride. The following spring, he did something even more audacious than crossing the Alps. To get around a Roman army blocking the easy road south, he took his men through the marshes at the mouth of the Arno. Days of wading through flooded, disease-ridden ground where the men could not lie down to sleep and had to rest on the corpses of the pack animals that had died in the muck. Hannibal himself, riding the last surviving elephant, is said to have contracted an infection in the swamp that cost him the sight in one eye. He came out of that marsh half-blind, with an army that had marched through hell twice now, and he came out behind the Roman consul who had been trying to stop him, right in the man's blind spot, deep in Italy. And then he did the thing that showed he understood Romans better than they understood themselves. He began to march past the Roman army toward Rome, burning the countryside as he went, torching farms, destroying crops, provoking, insulting, daring the consul to do something. Because he knew the political pressure on that man. He knew a Roman commander could not sit still and watch Italy burn while an enemy strolled past him. The Roman consul, goaded beyond endurance, broke camp and set off in furious pursuit, which brought both armies to the shore of a lake wrapped in morning fog. And I want you to be in the Roman column that morning, because it is one of the most chilling scenes in the history of warfare. The road ran along the northern shore of the lake, squeezed into a narrow strip between the water on one side and a line of steep wooded hills on the other. Behind the Romans, the road entered this defile through a narrow pass. Ahead, it climbed out over a hill. The Roman consul, still in a rage, still convinced Hannibal was running from him, marched his entire army straight into that corridor at first light, and the whole lake was blanketed in a thick morning mist rising off the water. The Romans could see the road in front of their feet. They could not see the hills above them. And they did not scout them. They were already inside the trap. They just couldn't see it. Hannibal had spent the previous day placing his entire army along those wooded slopes in the fog and the dark. His heavy infantry sat on the hill at the far end of the defile, blocking the exit. His cavalry sat hidden near the narrow entrance, ready to seal the way out once the last Roman was inside. And along the whole length of the ridge above the marching column, invisible in the mist, crouched his Gauls and his light troops, looking down on the backs of an army that had no idea it was being watched. Then the last of the Romans passed into the defile. The trap closed at the entrance, and the signal was given. They came down out of the fog on every side at once, an army of some 25,000 to 30,000 Romans, strung out thin along a lakeshore road, still in marching column, unable to form a proper line, was hit simultaneously from the front, from the hills above, and from the rear. The sources describe men who never even understood what was happening, who died before they could find their officers, before the order to form ranks could reach them, cut down in a mist so thick they could not see the enemy killing them. Some, driven off the road, waded into the lake itself to escape and drowned in their armor, or were killed by cavalry riding into the shallows after them. It was less a battle than a controlled massacre, and it was over in a matter of hours. The Roman consul died there, cut down in the chaos on the lakeshore. One account says he was killed by a Gallic horseman who had been searching the field for him. Around 15,000 Romans were killed at Lake Trasimene, and roughly 10,000 more were taken prisoner. An entire consular army, gone in a single morning in the fog, most of them never having landed a meaningful blow. It remains one of the largest and most complete battlefield ambushes ever recorded, the kind of thing that shouldn't be possible with tens of thousands of men. Now travel with the news to Rome, because there is a moment recorded here that I think about often. When word of the disaster reached the city, a magistrate stood before the crowd gathered in the forum, and he did not soften it, did not spin it, did not reach for comfort. He simply told them the truth in a single line. We have been beaten in a great battle. The whole city, the sources say, poured into the streets in panic, women searching for word of husbands and sons, the gates of a republic that had never known a hand at its throat, suddenly feeling very thin. And here is what made it worse than any single defeat. They now had no way to stop him. 2 consular armies destroyed in under 2 years, a consul dead. The road to Rome, for the first time in the memory of anyone living, apparently open. In their terror, the Romans did something they only ever did when the sky was falling. They appointed a dictator, a single man with absolute power to handle the emergency. But even that was not the bottom. Because Trasimene, as horrifying as it was not the disaster that would nearly end the Roman state. It was the warm-up. Rome had not yet learned the deepest lesson Hannibal had to teach, and it would learn it on a hot summer day on a dusty plain in the south, where a Roman army nearly twice the size of his own would march out confident of victory, and Hannibal would do something with it that had never been done before, and is still taught in military academies today. He would take the largest army Rome had ever assembled, let it push into the center of his line, and then close his wings around it, like a fist around a heart, and swallow it whole. The plain was called Cannae, and on that summer morning the Romans looked across it and saw an army they were sure they could crush by weight alone. They had done everything their pride demanded. Furious at years of being outmaneuvered, they had raised the largest field army in the Republic's history and sent it south with orders to end this. Depending on which count you trust, somewhere around 80,000 men marched onto that plain, against Hannibal's 50,000 or so. Nearly 2 to 1. The Romans intended to do the simplest thing in the world: form up in a deep, dense mass and drive straight through the center of the smaller army, like a battering ram through a door. And Hannibal let them think it would work. That was the whole trick. He drew his line up in a shape no one had ever deliberately used before. A shallow crescent that bulged outward toward the Romans, with his weakest troops, the Gauls and Spaniards, packed into the bulging center, and his hardened African veterans held back on the wings. Then he told the center to do the one thing that goes against every soldier's instinct: to give ground. Slowly. On purpose. Now stand in the front rank of that Roman mass and feel what happened. Because it is the cruelest thing about the day. You push forward. The enemy center bends back. You push again. It bends further. You are winning. Every man in that gigantic Roman block can feel it. The enemy folding in front of them. And so they press harder, pour in from behind, funnel deeper and deeper into the shrinking pocket the Carthaginian center is opening for them. The crescent that once bulged toward them slowly caves inward until it becomes a bag.
and the Roman army is climbing eagerly into it.
Then the wings closed. Hannibal's African veterans, fresh and untouched, wheeled inward from both sides. And his cavalry, having already smashed the Roman horsemen off the field, came thundering back and slammed into the Roman rear, sealing the mouth of the bag. In the span of an afternoon, the largest army Rome had ever fielded found itself surrounded on all four sides, packed so tightly that the men in the middle could not raise their arms to fight, could not run, could not do anything but stand and wait to be killed. An army of 80,000 had been turned into a crowd, and a crowd cannot fight. What followed was not a battle anymore. It was hours of methodical killing on a shrinking patch of ground, the Carthaginians working inward from the edges the way you'd eat toward the core of an apple. The numbers the ancient sources give are so large they stop feeling real. Somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Roman soldiers died at Cannae in a single day. Read that again. In one afternoon, on one field, Rome lost more men than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War. A large share of the Roman Senate, the ruling class of the whole republic, was wiped out in a few hours, along with one of the two consuls. The other consul survived only by riding off the field. There is a detail from the aftermath that I have never been able to shake. In the days that followed, a Carthaginian officer collected gold rings from the bodies of the Roman knights on the field. The rings only men of rank were entitled to wear, and later, back in Carthage, he is said to have poured them out onto the floor of the Senate to show them the scale of the victory. A cascade of rings, pulled from dead men's hands, rattling across the marble. If you want to understand why generals still walk the field at Cannae 2,000 years later, that's it. This is the day that gave warfare its ultimate word for total destruction. The double envelopment. The enemy swallowed whole. Commanders from antiquity to the modern era have chased the ghost of this single afternoon, trying to do again what Hannibal did with a smaller army against a larger one, and almost none of them ever managed it. After Cannae, by every rule that has ever governed war, Rome was finished. 3 enormous armies destroyed in 3 years. The flower of its aristocracy dead in the dirt. Its Italian allies beginning to defect. The most brilliant general of the age camped in the heart of its country, with the road to the city apparently wide open. And Rome refused to surrender. I want to sit with that, because it is the strangest and most important fact in the entire war. There was no rule that said you had to keep fighting after Cannae. Every other power in the ancient world would have sued for peace, sent envoys, offered tribute, given up the disputed territory, and thanked the gods to still exist. When Hannibal's own cavalry commander urged him to march on the city immediately, telling him that in a few days he could be dining in victory on the capital itself, Hannibal hesitated. And the officer is said to have snapped back the line that has followed Hannibal for 2,000 years. That he knew how to win a victory, but not how to use one. Whether those exact words were spoken, we can't know, but the accusation underneath them cuts to the bone of everything that happened next. Because Hannibal did not march on Rome. He couldn't take a walled city that size without siege engines, without supplies, without reinforcements, and he was gambling, reasonably, that after a slaughter like Cannae, the Roman Confederation would simply break apart and hand him the war. It didn't. Rome refused to acknowledge that it had lost, and by refusing, it turned Hannibal's greatest victory into a kind of trap. This is where the man who beat Hannibal without ever fighting him steps into the story. Even before Cannae, one Roman commander had looked at all this and reached a conclusion nobody wanted to hear: that fighting Hannibal in open battle was a way to lose armies. and that Rome's real advantage wasn't its soldiers, it was that it had an endless supply of them, and Hannibal had none. So he refused to give battle at all. He shadowed the Carthaginian army across Italy, hovering on the high ground, cutting off stragglers and foragers, and never, ever coming down to fight the pitched battle Hannibal desperately needed. The Romans hated it. They gave that commander a mocking nickname, the Delayer, because to a people raised on the idea that a real man meets the enemy face to face, watching an enemy army burn your farms while your general does nothing felt like cowardice. It was cowardice that would win the war. Because think about what Hannibal actually faced. Every man he lost was gone forever. No reinforcements were coming from a home government that had never fully backed his invasion, and he was recruiting from Italian tribes who wavered the instant Rome looked strong again. Every man Rome lost was replaced by next year's harvest of young farmers. It was a war between a magnificent sword and an anvil that simply would not break, and the anvil was winning. So watch what happens to the greatest general in the world when he can win every battle, but cannot end the war. He wanders. For years and years he marches up and down Italy, unbeaten, undefeated, and slowly starving. Winning cities that then get retaken the moment he moves on, watching allies drift back to Rome, watching his irreplaceable veterans die of age and disease, and small skirmishes that no chronicle even bothers to name. The most feared army in the world was being ground down, not in some great climactic battle, but by time and distance, and the sheer refusal of an enemy to fight him. He had come to Italy to break Rome's will. It turned out, Rome had more will than he had years. And while Hannibal was withering in Italy, a young Roman was learning to become him. This is the man who finally ended it. And the beautiful, terrible thing about him is that he beat Hannibal by studying Hannibal. He had survived Cannae as a young officer, walked off that field of the dead as one of the few who escaped, and instead of concluding that Hannibal was unbeatable, he had spent years dissecting exactly how the Carthaginian won. He took Rome's war to Spain and stripped away the base of silver and manpower that had fed Hannibal's whole enterprise. And then he did the thing no cautious Roman would have dared. He argued that the way to beat Hannibal was not to keep chasing him around Italy, but to sail to Africa and threaten Carthage itself, to force the panicked Carthaginian government to do the one thing that could pull Hannibal out of Italy. It worked. After more than 15 years on Italian soil, Hannibal received the order to come home and defend the city he had left as a boy. He is said to have understood at once that this was the beginning of the end. According to the sources, he cursed and raged when the recall came. He had spent his entire adult life in the field, undefeated, and he was being pulled off the board not because he had lost, but because his own country was about to. He gathered what remained of his veterans, the men who had been with him across the Alps and through the fog at Trasimene and the killing pocket at Cannae, and he sailed back to a homeland most of them had never seen, and he had not seen since he was 9 years old. The two armies met at a place called Zama, and before the battle, the sources described something that never should have happened in a war this savage. The two generals asked to meet, face to face, in the space between the lines. Hannibal, past 50 now, the terror of a generation, and the young Roman who had spent his life learning to defeat him, stood together and talked. Through interpreters, each with a small guard. Hannibal, the accounts say, spoke of the turning of fortune, warned the younger man not to trust too much in his own luck, and offered peace. The Roman answered that Carthage had had its chances and broken every one of them, and that it was too late for words. They saluted each other and went back to their armies to decide it with steel. At Zama, for the first time in his life, Hannibal was out-generaled. The young Roman had learned every lesson the master had ever taught. When Hannibal sent his elephants charging forward, the Roman had arranged his lines with lanes deliberately left open so the huge animals thundered harmlessly through the gaps instead of crashing into a solid wall of men. Hannibal's own trick of turning the enemy's expectation against him, used against Hannibal. And crucially, the cavalry advantage that had won Hannibal every battle in Italy now belonged to the other side, because the Roman had made an alliance with the Numidian horsemen who had once served Carthage. When those horsemen swept the Carthaginian cavalry from the field and then came back to strike Hannibal's infantry in the rear, the exact maneuver that had sealed the bag at Cannae, the greatest general of the age lost the only major battle he ever fought.
20,000 of his men died at Zama. Hannibal escaped the field, and Carthage, at last, surrendered for good. The terms broke the city forever. It gave up its overseas empire, surrendered its fleet, and agreed never to make war again without Rome's permission. Reduced from a Mediterranean superpower to a client that existed only at Rome's pleasure. It's a strange thing to say about the man who lost, but even here, Hannibal was not finished. He went home, not to the army, but to the government, got himself elected to Carthage's highest office, and turned out to be as brilliant an administrator as he had been a general, reforming the corrupt finances so effectively that Carthage began paying off its enormous war debt to Rome ahead of schedule, without new taxes, simply by rooting out the officials who had been stealing from the state. And this is the part that tells you how deep the fear ran. Rome could not stand it. Even beaten, even reduced to running a single city, Hannibal was too dangerous to be allowed to live in peace. His enemies at home, the wealthy men whose corruption he had exposed, sent word to Rome that he was plotting a new war, and Rome demanded his surrender. So the man who had marched an army over the Alps became a fugitive, an old man fleeing across the ancient world one step ahead of Roman agents, welcomed at foreign courts until Rome leaned on them, and then moving on again, from kingdom to kingdom, always hunted, always the prize that would buy a king Rome's favor. The end came at a small court in the east, where Hannibal had taken shelter with a king who was himself losing a war against Rome. When Roman envoys arrived, and the king agreed to hand him over, Hannibal found his hiding place surrounded, every exit guarded. The sources say he had known this day would come for years and had prepared for it, that he carried poison with him always, hidden in a ring, for exactly this moment. Rather than be dragged in chains through the streets of the city he had spent his whole life trying to destroy, he drank it. His last words, according to one account, were a bitter observation about how long the Romans had waited and how much trouble they had gone to be rid of one old man they could no longer bear to leave alive. He was around 64. He died in exile, far from Carthage, hunted to the last by the enemy he had sworn at that altar never to befriend. And, in a way that would have satisfied that 9-year-old boy, he never did break the oath. He was never once the friend of Rome. He died rather than let Rome touch him. Now here is the ending that history could not resist. Within a single lifetime, Rome came back to Carthage one final time. And this time, there would be no terms, no surrender that mattered. Rome destroyed the city utterly, burned it, killed or enslaved its people, and erased it from the map so completely that for centuries people believed a legend that the Romans had sown the ground with salt, so nothing would ever grow there again. The scholars now doubt the salt was real, but they don't doubt the fear behind it. Rome did not simply defeat Carthage, it annihilated it, because as long as Carthage existed, the memory of the man who had nearly ended Rome lived with it. And that is why they could never stop saying his name. For generations afterward,
Roman parents frightened their children with it. "Hannibal is at the gates," they would say, the way we might invoke a monster in the dark. He became the enemy against whom every future general was measured, the ghost in the room whenever Rome imagined losing. He won almost every battle a man can win, and still lost his war, still lost his city, still died alone with poison in a ring at the far edge of the world. And yet 2,000 years later, it is his name we remember, and his crossing, and his crescent line bending back at Cannae. Not the names of the careful men who actually beat him. There's the paradox we started with, and now you can feel the full weight of it. Winning every battle was never the point. Rome understood something Hannibal, for all his genius, could not overcome. That a nation that refuses to admit it has lost is almost impossible to defeat, no matter how many of its armies you destroy. Hannibal beat Rome again and again and again, and Rome simply would not agree to be beaten. In the end, the man who could not lose a battle lost to the one enemy who would not accept losing.
That is the story the boy at the altar grew up to live. And it is, I think, the strangest survival story the ancient world ever produced. Not his, but the city he failed to kill. If this story pulled you in, if you felt even for a moment what it was like to stand on those walls and hear that Rome had been beaten in a great battle, do the one thing that keeps these stories being told. Subscribe and leave a like before you go. There are more of these waiting, more men who nearly changed the world and were swallowed by it. More empires that should have fallen and somehow didn't. Stay, and I'll take you to them next.